Wonderworks by leading story scientist Angus Fletcher is a richly detailed, extraordinary exploration that offers a new understanding of the power of literature as it examines literary inventions through the ages, from ancient Mesopotamia to Ilana Ferrante. Inventions that show how writers have created technical breakthroughs, rivaling any scientific inventions, and engineering enhancements to the human heart and mind. This book has caught the attention of Malcolm Gladwell, who tweeted that it was fascinating and, quote, blew my mind. Angus Fletcher is a professor of story science at Ohio State's Project Narrative, the world's leading academic think tank for the study of stories. He has dual degrees in neuroscience and literature, received his PhD from Yale, taught Shakespeare at Stanford, and has published 2 books and dozens of peer-reviewed academic articles on the scientific workings of novels, poetry, film, and theater. His research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, and the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. He has done story consulting for projects for Sony, Disney, the BBC, Amazon, PBS, and Universal, and is the author-presenter of the Audible Great Courses Guide to Screenwriting. Angus, it is a thrill for me to welcome you tonight and for Gramercy Books to share your book with our community.
Well, as everyone knows, this is the best bookstore in the world, and so I am thrilled and honored to be here.
Well, thank you, Angus. And in conversation with Angus is Michelle Herman. Michelle is the author of 4 novels, Missing, Dog, Devotion, and the forthcoming Close Up, and the novella collection, A New and Glorious Life, as well as 3 essay collections. She has authored a book for children, a girl's guide to life. Her essays and short fiction have appeared in a wide range of periodicals, from American Scholar to O, the Oprah magazine, and she writes a weekly column for Slate. She has taught creative writing at the Ohio State University for many years and was a founder of the MFA program in creative writing there. Michelle, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here, and I second everything Angus said about the bookstore.
Well,
to talk to Angus in public, since talking to each other is one of our favorite things to do.
Well, I'm going to let the 2 of you talk now, and I want to just wish a warm welcome for everyone to Angus Fletcher and Michelle Herman.
Thanks, Linda. So Angus, my dear, renegade English professor, my first question for you is not why did you write this book, as you suggested I ask you, because I think I know why you wrote the book. I'm really interested in something you said that you state plainly toward the very end of the book, where you seem to suggest that the way we've all been taught to read is wrong, and that the literature classes we take, starting with the study of the books we read in elementary school and going all the way through college and graduate school, where we look at books as kind of mysteries to be unlocked in terms of finding out what they're telling us. You know, they're supposed to convince us of something. And since I was an undergraduate who hated my English classes for that very reason, I'm interested in having you start by talking about what people are supposed to be reading literature for, if not the things that we were taught we're supposed to read it for.
Well, absolutely, Michelle. And thank you so much for that question. And thank you so much for being here with me. This is such a joy. So the short answer to that is that people should be reading literature for whatever they want. This to me is the big difference between when I learned to read as a child and when I was taught to read in school, is when I went to a library or a bookstore, I felt the most enormous sense of freedom. I just felt this enormous sense of possibility. I felt like I could go anywhere and be anyone and do anything. And it's just the most magical, extraordinary thing to be surrounded by all these books and to feel that choice. And I think what happens to a lot of us in school is we are then assigned a book. we are told what to read, and then we are told how to read it. And the way in which we are told to read is to essentially turn the book into an exercise in philosophy or rhetoric, critical thinking, argument, all these skills which are incredibly useful. Obviously, there isn't enough argument in the world. We definitely need to be having more arguments as people. But the primordial thing that I think excited us when we first read a book was its power to make us feel less lonely, its power to make us feel joy, its power to heal us, its power to pop our imagination. And so more than anything else, I just want to empower everyone out there who's felt just the enormous number of things literature can do to the brain and say, you weren't wrong to feel those things. And in fact, literature can maybe do more things than you guess. And the exciting thing for all of us moving forward is that there is a different way to think about literature that can help us unlock more and more and more and more of those things. And so unlock more and more and more of our human potential. And I think start to fill in so much of what we feel as we look around is missing from our world right now.
Well, I was grateful and delighted to hear someone actually saying this, but it especially seemed subversive coming from a fellow English professor, right? I mean, I feel in some ways that people like you and me are hiding in plain sight in English departments, right? I was especially struck by, there's a common sense aspect to all of this. You know, we're coming to books to learn how to be better friends, to learn how to be less lonely. There's a long list, obviously, it's a big book, of things that we can learn from literature in a non-pedantic way. But what strikes me as so fascinating is the way you are breaking it down and making science of it. Can you talk about how you got to a place where you went from something we know instinctively, we read to become happier and to lose ourselves in books and to be not so lonely, to turning it into a science?
Yeah, so first of all, if I can just celebrate the first point you made, and then I'll answer the question. I mean, the first point you made is that people like you and I are routinely made to feel stupid. I mean, we're frequently attacked for being dumb. And I think a lot of times when you go into a literature class and you say, this book touched my heart, or I fell in love with this character, or this author's voice spoke to me, or I felt so much courage and love when I read this piece, you're told, okay, that's not how we talk about things. And my entire career, I've been, as a, you know, in terms of studying literature, I've been attacked as being an anti-intellectual, as someone who is dumbing down literature or is too stupid himself to realize what the kind of real thing is going on in literature. And a big part of why I wrote the book is to say, you know, we can have the most intellectual conversations we want to have, and I love those conversations, but it's not stupid to care about empathy. It's not stupid to care about courage. It's not stupid to honor our instincts and our feelings. And I think we should celebrate some of those basic things that we just all feel and know. And one of the reasons I felt honestly empowered to write the book is my daughter. She's so young. And, you know, when you see a child read and they're so fearless, and the things they love in books are the things that we all start loving in books. And then all of a sudden, you know, these classes become about other things and why. And so, you know, what I wanted to do in the book is show you can actually talk about all these things that people say are anti-intellectual, you know, like emotions and imagination. And you can talk about them in a way that is smart, that uses science. Not that science is smarter than the heart, but in our modern world, it has that currency. So I just wanted to show, look, even neuroscience confirms this is smart stuff. And we all know, I mean, that writers, they're the first psychologists. Writers are the first neuroscientists. Before we had a science of the mind, we had playwrights and poets and then novelists who plumbed the depths of the mind and taught us things about ourselves. I mean, how many times have we picked up a book in our lives and felt that the book was looking into our own head and seeing something in our own mind? It's like a literal brain scanner before the brain scanner was invented. So I just wanted to honor that intelligence. as to how the book works, I mean, one of the basic things that I just like to get across in the book is that this isn't just a bunch of stuff that I think. This is a method. It's a different method for reading that you can take to any book and you can use to teach yourself, and you can use to unlock more of the secrets of literature. And it starts by shifting what we're taught in school. What we're taught in school is that literature is words on a page. And what I say is, well, that's certainly one way to look at it. But another way to think about it is literature is something that's written to pop our brains. It's a voice speaking to us. It's something we hear. And when you stop looking at the words on the page and start analyzing what goes on in your head, or to be technical, your brain, you start to unlock all these things about literature that, as you say, are common sense. So the first thing is neuroscience tells us that humans are very, very interested in other humans. That's one of the things we most like to do is look at other humans, study other humans. And so what is one of the most powerful things about literature? Characters and voices, the voice of the author, making that human connection with the author. Another thing that as humans we're very interested in is things that happen. You know, I mean, going back to our primordial ancestors, things that happen. I mean, in our environment, that's the stuff we had to notice to. Something changed, so plots, obviously very important. And then finally, our ancestors were nomadic. They traveled around. They had to constantly explore new environments. And who hasn't felt that joy reading a book, of feeling like you've walked into another world? And sometimes that world can be science fiction or fantasy, but sometimes it can be the world right on your block that you never knew about. Sometimes it can be a world that's happening here and now, but because of the way the writer tells that story, because of the way she crafts it, you feel like you have expanded what this world is. And so these are all insights that just come from shifting the focus from the words to the brain. And neuroscience has advanced to the point now where we can start to call that a science, although frankly, I would be just as happy to call it an art, and I would be just as happy to call it an intuition and common sense, because really what science is doing is backing up and refining what I think every writer and reader has known from the beginning.
So what's interesting to me, I mean, it's all interesting to me, but one piece of it that I found myself thinking about is, particularly as I got to the conclusion of the book, why are we taught to read the way we're taught to read?
Yes, I can answer that question. So basically what happened in the early 20th century is that there was a severe anxiety about the rigorousness of literary education. And this was just as literature was actually becoming a discipline. And classics had long been a discipline, and English was starting to become English language and literature at universities like Cambridge and Oxford, and then eventually over in the States was becoming a discipline. But there was all this anxiety. How do we make it rigorous? How do we convince people that it's a science like chemistry is? And a guy called I.A. Richards started something that became known as the New Criticism. And he said that the way to make literature a science was essentially to have a science of words, and to develop semiotics, and to apply logic, essentially the same logic that's run on computer hard drives now, the syllogism, to literature. And what ends up happening is when you study the words of literature in this way, as we discovered over the 20th century, we lose everything. Because it turns out when you look at the words, the more you look at them, the more anything can happen with them. And there's actually no stability in that. There's no bottom in that. It doesn't really work. But that was the sort of thing that we had been taught from the beginning was the only way to make ourselves respectable. And, you know, I just want to say there's a different kind of science. There's neuroscience, and neuroscience is different from logic, and it can unlock more things. And I don't want to stop people who are interested in the logical side and interested in examining literature as words. But, you know, when you examine literature as words, you sort of mistake what's happening for the medium in which it's happening. It would be like if you went to a sculpting school and all you did was study rock. If you studied rock for a long period of time, that would probably help you become a sculptor, but you wouldn't learn anything about being a sculptor, you know, or if you wanted to be an engineer and all you did was study steel. And you studied steel and you learned about how all the molecules interact with each other, but how would you build an engine or a spaceship? And, you know, that's the same thing with words, because really, even when we talk about how literature is beautiful and Shakespeare is a wordsmith and so, what we're really talking about is the voice. We're really saying, I can hear the person speaking. I can hear her.
What's interesting to me about what you just said is, so by studying a rock, you can't become a sculptor. But we're talking now about, I mean, there's no question that studying literature in the way we've been taught to study literature has never made anyone a writer. In fact, it's probably gotten in the way of a lot of people becoming writers or writing well. But you're not talking about studying the thing to make the thing. You're talking about the difference between studying the thing and then consuming. Consuming is such an awful word for it. But you could look at rock for a long time and still not know anything about what it means when you appreciate a work of sculptural art, right? That's really what we're talking about.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, no. I mean, imagine if you went into a museum and the museum guide, instead of telling you about the beauty and the shape of the sculpture you're looking at, spent 45 minutes explaining the qualities of granite to you. And you were like, well, that's very interesting. And they were like, look at the fine veining of this marble. And you were like, that's wonderful. Maybe I should make a countertop of it. But, don't you think that maybe Michelangelo was thinking something different when he did his David? But I will also say, and be honest with you, that I think we should do a lot more creative writing in school in general, because I think creative writing is one of the ways you learn to use literature too. And I don't think that everyone who takes a creative writing class has to become a creative writer for it to be an enormously wonderful experience for them. Because when you actually get into how the literature works, when you actually start to craft a poem, you start to realize, oh my goodness, this is what's going on in the poem. And using it in that way teaches you so much. And I would just say, Michelle, pretty much almost everything I've learned in my career, I have learned from working with creative writers. Whether it's you, whether it's the students that I'm fortunate to teach in our MFA program at Ohio State, talking to writers, working with writers, going through drafts with writers, seeing that process unfold. And I think, rather than spending so much time analyzing words in school, we should spend more time writing plays, writing sonnets, writing novels, writing memoirs, writing comic books, writing. And I think creative writing should be ultimately part of the backbone of any serious literary education.
You're preaching to the choir. I mean, I have always felt that teaching, particularly teaching undergraduates creative writing, is creating a generation of readers. I will tell you, I'm not sure I've ever told you this before, I might as well tell you in front of all our audience, that years ago, when I first began teaching at Ohio State, a colleague in the department, who was also someone I became close to, joked that I should never teach a literature class, because here's what would happen if I taught a literature class. He said, I would say, go home and read this book. And then the next week when they'd come back, I'd say, didn't you love that book? Okay, now go home and read this book. And there's something to be said for my feeling that way. I mean, I do teach literature in my creative writing classes, but not in the way it's taught in literature classes. We're not analyzing, we're not looking for a rhetorical argument, we're not looking for themes, we're looking at the way the character is created on the page. We're looking at, what makes up voice? What are the, if we're looking at words, we're looking at, what are those choices of words that have created that voice that we're hearing? I want to remind people that you can, because I see comments are going in the chat, you can put questions in the Q&A. Those are the only ones we'll see. And I will be reading those questions out loud. And you can put questions in there anytime. Anytime Angus says something that sparks your imagination, go ahead and put a question in the Q&A box. Angus, one thing I noticed when I was reading this book is that you seem to have read virtually everything that has ever been written and watched every TV show that has ever been on TV. I have never felt so underread and underwatched as I did while reading. Have you actually read every single work of literature you mentioned and watched all those television shows and movies? When do you sleep?
No, well, I'll be honest with you. Yes, I have. Although I have not, as I've admitted in other interviews, read most or even very much of literature. I've confined myself in the book. It's the only 400 things I've ever read, I promise you. The reason I've read so much is because I teach differently. And the way that I teach is I don't set the syllabus. I don't start at the beginning of the semester and say, here are the 15 books that I think you should read. I start at the beginning of the semester and I say, I want every student in this class to pick the book that has most changed them, or the TV show that has most changed them, or the comic book, or the memoir, or the poem, anything that has most changed. And that's our syllabus. And so every semester I go in and I don't read the books ahead of time. I just read them at the same time the students are reading them. And first of all, I do that because I want to learn. I mean, I don't want the classroom to be a space where I'm telling people, my opinions about the books that I think are great, and reinstantiating this whole structure of authority that, as you were talking about, really is the most awful thing about English departments. Not all English departments. I think our English department doesn't necessarily fall into this trap. But I think that one of the things that happens a lot is you feel, as a creative writing member or another member of the department, that somehow, oh, you haven't read Shakespeare as thoroughly as I have. Please let me explain to you how your reading of Hamlet is incorrect. So first of all, I want to completely eliminate that. And I want the students to be the authorities in the room, not me. I want us all to kind of learn in that way. And then second of all, what I want to say is, if you have a real method of reading, if your method of reading really works, it should work on stuff that you haven't read before. I, as the teacher, should bring the method. The students should bring the books. And I should give them the method, and then we should read the books together, and then they can decide whether or not my method is working. And that kind of democratic approach is the main reason that I've read a lot of the stuff that I've read, because if it were just up to me, I would probably just be reading like Hardy Boys novels, or something like that, and my mind has been blown. I mean, I discovered Maya Angelou in a class, a student brought in Maya Angelou, and that's essentially my favorite book of all time. I mean, I was transformed. I was just kind of brought to tears reading that. And so many of my favorite books have come from students. And the main takeaway from that is that most of us in our lives associate literature with doing one or two really important kinds of things for us. So maybe we associate them with comfort or whatever, but other people use literature for different things than we do. And the more we can kind of get together and see how we all use literature for different things, we can share that wisdom, then we can all start to grow by using literature in the ways that other people use it. So we can learn. I mean, I've learned so much from my students. And we can also do that wonderful thing where when someone comes to you and says, I'm in this place in my life, what do I do? Instead of giving them advice, we can give them a book. And we can sometimes even give them a book that we don't even get because we've never been through that ourselves, but we just know the book is going to work for them because it's worked for so many other people in our lives. And that kind of community thing, that magic that happens when we all get together and share our favorite books, that's what I try and do in the classroom. That's what I try and cultivate. And that's the reason why it looks like I've read everything. But really, I've just read everything that my students have read.
And it's such a wide range of things, and that explains it. Here's a weird thing, Angus. You and I have never talked about this. So you don't know that the way I begin my graduate seminars always is to create a class anthology in which every student in the class, that's how we decide what we're going to read. If it's a fiction class, they supply a short story they love. And if it's a nonfiction class, they supply an essay. And those 15 stories or essays are the texts that we sort of start from. That's bizarre, actually, because I've never talked to anyone else who's done anything like that.
Well, doesn't this just make you believe that really creative writing faculty should have more of a say in the way that classes work? I mean, no, and not pandering to you, but legitimately. I mean, to me, the term I would just use is wisdom, is experience, is kind of deep living in the literature. And of course, as a creative writer, you have that love and that openness and that desire to share, as opposed to the desire to judge and to criticize and to categorize, And I think that anyone who becomes a creative writing teacher does it for one main reason, which is to empower other voices. I mean, that's why you become a creative writing teacher, is because you want to have other people speak in their way, the way that they do it. And I think, honestly, what I was trained to do, I got my PhD at Yale, I was not trained to empower. I was trained to dominate. I was trained to crush the other critics. I was trained to win, to have the best argument, to dismantle, to break, to destroy. And I honestly think that that is a lot of the problem that the humanities has got itself into, is we are trained relentlessly in critique and critical thinking. We're not trained in creative thinking. We're not trained in positive thinking and in giving and in joy and in empowering. And those are actually the things that humanities does amazingly well. And there's nothing wrong with critical thinking. I mean, it's good to be skeptical, and there's nothing wrong with arguments. I mean, really, there isn't, because you need to be able to defend yourself in this world. But on the other hand, there is this enormous, I think, untapped value in the wisdom of writers and playwrights and script writers and poets. And I think kind of one of the ways that would be so simple to start to reverse the decline in enrollments in literature departments is to empower that silent half. Because honestly, that's most of what students really want to do when they come into an English class, is they want to understand, how did my favorite writer do it? And how do I do it too?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I mean, I'm with you. I think creative writing should rule the world. But it is actually a remarkable experience for me when I have students bring in what I ask them to bring. And of course, I've never asked them to bring whole books, because I can't imagine, since we're spending most of our time reading their work, also reading 15 books. But it tells me very quickly so much about them. I feel like by the second week, I know them really well. If out of every short story in the entire world, this is the one they've picked, it's a kind of shorthand of information. And it's also true, of course, that I've read writers I would never otherwise have read, and have read in genres I would never otherwise read. But I like knowing that that's the trick behind you having watched, Buffy and read The Godfather, and I mean, Cervantes, everything across the universe.
I mean, isn't that really just the secret to life? Just listening to other people, just opening yourself up to the just enormous human diversity. And absolutely, I am everything I am because of everybody else I've met in my life, and I'm nothing because of myself. And
yeah, no, it's certainly the secret to connectiveness and happiness. So the idea then of taking this enormous enthusiasm that you have, and in a way doing battle, getting up, taking up your sword and doing battle with the academic idea of what literature is for, but then reframing it in a highly intellectualized way. I'm still really interested in, I mean, it can't be simply, I'm gonna sound smart. I'm writing this book, so I'm gonna be really smart. Obviously, it's not that. Like, what? I guess this is the question that you want, you said, just ask me that. I mean, how did it start? How did the project itself begin of writing this book and taking those various inventions one by one in the course of it?
so, I mean, the ultimate genesis for the book is simply that I was trained as a neuroscientist. And I spent years and years and years of my life working in a neuroscience lab, understanding how we think the brain works, but, I mean, more importantly, understanding the method of science and kind of how to go about it. And that allowed me to start building partnerships over my life, because I left neuroscience, not because I didn't love it. I think science is wonderful. And I come from a family of scientists and doctors and engineers, but because I felt there was just a missing piece. And what I did for my early career was just focus on literature and try and read literature the way that I was taught to read literature in graduate school, and read it like everybody else who's a graduate student. But over time, what I started to realize as I met people, and particularly students, was that so much of this neuroscience knowledge I had in my head was actually helping unlock things for them. And what I then started to do is I started to form research partnerships with Antonio Damasio's lab at USC, with Martin Seligman's lab at the University of Pennsylvania, with hospitals, and start to do this research. And the way that it essentially works is I apply this simple method, which I talk about in the book, where you listen to your brain or the brains of others. And when something pops, you go look at the part of the literary work where it popped, and you start to try and identify what's special about it, what's unique, what was being done here that was different. And if you start to pull those pieces out, you can then start to test them and see, do they occur in other works? Do they have the same effect in those other works? You know, we can start to run experiments, you know, we can start to actually have kind of crazy Dr. Frankenstein experiments and put people in brain scanners when they're reading Hamlet and do all that kind of stuff. So yes, it's not easy work on a certain level. I mean, and one of the reasons I wrote the book is because there needs to be more research in this area. And, you know, basically I'm one of a few very kooky people who happens to have the expertise to do this. And we need a lot more kooks. And we also need a lot more money and funding to start to kind of build out. And I wrote this book to show how much we already know, and to hopefully inspire and excite people. But the purpose of this book is not to say, close the book on this. The purpose of this book is for you to say, you know what about this and what about this? And also to inspire future generations of writers to look at the book and say, how much innovation there has been, how much creativity there has been. And, you know, Michelle, when I read your work, you have a completely distinct voice. No one has ever written like you. You invented that. You know, it works in a completely different way in my mind. You know, we can talk about that at some point, but I mean, it, you know, the way that it works in terms of the feeling of connection I get, the feeling of flow that I get from your writing is completely distinct. And that's what writers have the opportunity to do, is invent and innovate. And so basically the method of the book is kind of picking up those inventions, those innovations, pairing them with the neuroscience. And because I'm lucky enough to exist at this really weird intersection where I could do those things, I was lucky enough to kind of be able to write this book, but hopefully as a gateway to other people to do more and better.
Okay, I think that's a really good segue into some of these questions, actually. Jerry wants to know, Angus, do you have a sense of where the next invention in literature is likely to occur? What excites you about what is showing up in today's leading edge books, movies, and TV?
So I think, honestly, I can tell you where it's going to occur in the sense that pretty much every inventor in the book comes out of left field. They're writing from a little bit of a margin. They're not completely off the grid, because you need to have that opportunity to have the training and the access to an audience and all those kinds of things. But everyone, whether it's Shakespeare or Austen or Angelou, Tina Fey, I mean, everyone who's writing is in some way writing from a position where they're not at the center. And so the one thing I can guarantee is that that writer is going to be different in some way. As to what they're going to do, I can't promise to tell you, because if I knew that, believe me, we would be trying I would be trying to create that now. And that to me is the kind of the joy and the wonder of it. We all know that book is out there. I mean, every time, this is the joy of being an editor at a publishing house, or, you know, going into a bookstore and seeing the new releases, is you just know one of them could change everything. And that happens frequently. So I can't tell you where it's coming from, but the evidence of the book is that it is coming soon.
That sounds like a crystal ball moment. Okay, Rebecca says, in a class I'm leading this semester, we're reading about the idea that science is useful and literary study is not, because science can be monetized, instrumentalized in a way that studying Don Quixote, for example, supposedly cannot. How does one make the case for the usefulness of literary study beyond whether or not it can make someone rich or get someone to pay for the teaching or writing of it? Good question.
No, absolutely. And that to me is the big thing about the book, is I want to convince people that literature is wonderful in so many ways, but one of the ways it's wonderful is that it is useful. So I'm going to come out and be honest and say that I've done a ton of consulting for Hollywood. And, you know, I try and empower my young writers to make a living. And I do want writers to be paid and to be valued. I think if a doctor makes a living wage, so should a writer. So I don't want to undervalue the material. I think, you know, a lot of writers spend a lot of time in hardship, kind of trying to scrabble together things together and kind of questioning their life choices. And I do want that monetary reward to be there. But yes, the ultimate utility of literature is that it helps all of us be our best selves. Or to be technical about it, it helps our brains heal and grow. So Literature, as I talk about in the book, can help us cope with trauma, with grief, with loneliness, with almost any kind of mental malady you can imagine. There is a literary remedy for it. And then literature can go beyond that, and literature can give us things like optimism. It can give us creativity. There's a chapter in the book where I talk about how literature makes you a better scientist. And in fact, there's a lot of reasons to suspect that literature is really the origins of modern science, and not just in a rhetorical way, but when you look back to the 17th century and the early 16th century, a lot of this comes out of literary training. And a lot of it is thought experiments by people like Galileo and whatnot that comes from their literary training. So literature can teach you to be a better scientist as well. So there's all this incredible utility in it, just in terms of making us our best selves. And as we become our best selves, what do? We build our best world. So that's probably my best argument for why literature is useful.
Good argument. Okay, Susan says, some proponents of close reading focus on specific phrases, images, figures, say that it can assist with mindfulness and attentiveness, which is also good for the brain. Is that another aspect of the brain science behind the reading of literature?
That's really interesting. So first of all, I'm not actually aware of that research, and so I don't want to comment on that specifically. But what I will say is happening there is that a technique, a way of reading, is therapeutic as opposed to the literature itself. And so what I want to talk about in the book is actually how reading literature without having any technique at all. I mean, just picking up a book and connecting to it and hearing the author's voice in your head is therapeutic, as opposed to being trained in close reading. If you find that training useful, then absolutely, I would encourage you to do that. But I talk about in chapter, I think it's 20, maybe 17 of the book, Virginia Woolf and Mrs. Dalloway invents a stream of mind technology that is equivalent to mindfulness, in which you flick in and out of other people's minds. And without having to learn how to close read, you can just pick up Mrs. Dalloway and get that same therapeutic effect. So absolutely, I think we want all the allies we can get. And I'm not here to kind of tear down close reading so much as to argue that there is another way of reading, and that both of them can kind of cohabit, and that both of them can have hopefully positive effects.
Thank you. Here's a question from Felicia. I work at a school where parents want their kids to read the classics. How do we make the shift to valuing diverse voices in literature?
Well, if I knew how to deal with parents, let me tell you, because the number of times I have to deal with a parent. Before I came to Ohio State, I worked at another university that will remain nameless in California, where I ran the arts and humanities dorm. And so we would attract tons and tons of arts and humanities students, 440 every year, in fact. And I would have probably about 440 agonized conversations with parents every year, in which they were like, can you really get a job when you study literature, or what have you? I mean, just, so I honestly would be lying if I knew how to deal with parents, but I'll tell you a couple of things you can say. First of all, you can point out to them that what we consider classic literature was really just popular literature back in the day. This is an artificial idea that was essentially created in the 19th century, largely by imperialists, many of them English, many of them German, who were like, oh, the Greeks. But in reality, people read Homer because they liked Homer. He was popular. He was just the most popular writer of the day. Sappho, who I think is possibly the greatest poet of all time, she was kept around because people loved her. And we know that they loved her because back then there was no printing press. So if you loved the poet, you had to write her words down on a piece of paper, on a piece of parchment for yourself. And then you had to keep recopying it because the papyrus was so fragile it would keep disintegrating. So all these early works, Jane Austen, one of the most popular writers in history. So to me, I would first just start by saying, look, classical literature is really just another word for old popular literature. So maybe we can have a mix of old and new popular. And I would also say, look, you can hand them a chapter from the book, and every single chapter of the book does the same thing. It starts with a work that's usually considered classic, and then it gives you half a dozen other works that are more modern, even comic books, films, TV shows. And you can say to them, it's science. I didn't want to believe it myself. I didn't want to believe that, in fact, you could, watch 30 Rock by this Tina Fey person, and it could be the same as Don Quixote, but it's science, and science, it's science. So maybe that will help.
Wait, are you suggesting that she insists that all the parents buy a copy of this book? There would be a good sales strategy. You have a question about what I'm teaching your children, buy this book and you will understand.
No, absolutely. And in general, that's my answer for everything in life. Just buy the book. That will help you.
Yeah, that's a good answer. This is interesting. So Larry asked a question that I actually had on my mind. He says, other than suggestions from your students, how do you select what you read? And I would even expand that to, what you watch, what you listen to. And I'm going to contextualize this because you mentioned so many writers across so many areas that when you don't mention someone, I found myself thinking, why is that? Aaron Sorkin, for example, who I think is really one of the best writers writing today. It seems a notable absence. So that made me wonder if you watch Sorkin movies and TV shows and where you would put him in this cataloging. But I also want you to answer Larry's question. So answer my question and Larry's.
So as far as Sorkin goes, I would put him in the chapter or around the chapter related to the chapter with Don Quixote. And that kind of in and out feeling you get, that it's always real, but also being made at the same time. The answer to why there aren't, people have asked me, they've been like, why aren't there any Russian novelists in this book and things like that? Well, the answer to that question is when I pitched it to the publisher, I told them I would like to have the 100 greatest inventions in the history of literature. And then the publisher made a funny face and I said, okay, if you'd like 250, we can do 250 inventions. And the publisher was like, how long would the book be if it was the 100 greatest inventions? I was like, I'm guessing probably about 2,000 pages. And the publisher was like, no. So essentially the idea behind the book is just to go with 25. And they're not, I wouldn't personally have called them the most powerful. I would have just called them very, 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 very powerful, but that does not sell books. So we're going with the most powerful. So the one thing I really do want to communicate is that this is meant to be a series of open doors. It's not meant to be authoritative. It's not meant to tell you that you should read these or make you feel bad if you haven't read them. It's supposed to be a guide and a resource to help you just keep exploring all the wonderful, glorious things that are out there. And, hopefully if this book does well, I'll get a chance to write, the next installment, do 25 more chapters. As far as what I read, when I was a child, I read everything. I literally, if I just came upon a book, I would just read it. And my strategy today is partly that. If I come upon a book, I will read it. I mean, I always do. If I hear about a book, I will read it. I love to discover things. I mean, to me, that's one of the reasons I got into this job is I just want to read everything and there just isn't time. So I just read what I stumble across. And I do read what other people share with me. One of the joys of having kids is you get to read a lot of stuff that they like. Friends suggest things. I read that. Or, I have my podcast friends. I listen to podcasts. Someone on a podcast reads something, I read that too. And that, to me, just gets to the bottom of the fact that literature really is a shared activity. It's a communal activity, even though it's become more private because of the technology of the book. Our favorite books are books we always want to share. I mean, when you have read a book that you love, the number one thing you really want to do is have a conversation with your friends about it. And if they haven't read it, you just want to buy them the book so you can have a conversation about it. And that, to me, that kind of communal space is where I get so many of my reading suggestions.
I guess this makes me want to ask you, are there go-to books that you will give people? Because I was just thinking that I have some, like if I have a friend who's going through a really hard time, any kind of hard time, there's a particular book I will always buy for them. And every woman in the last couple of years who's gotten pregnant, there are a couple of books that I will always buy for her. Do you have some kind of a book that people need to read under certain circumstances?
Well, I mean, that's kind of the idea of the book is to take that out of my personal preferences and put it in the hands of science, because yes, I would always suggest books that I liked, and that it helped me in those circumstances. And sometimes that would really work. But then sometimes it turned out the problem that the person was going through was different. and sometimes it turned out that my reading tastes weren't theirs. And so the idea behind the book is to kind of give you that sense, of like the broadness of it. But, I mean, the number one book I'm always giving to everyone is Mrs. Dalloway. I can't deny it. And also probably, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. I mean, those are just two books that I just give out like candy because they're just my two favorite books. I read them over and over again.
Okay, great. So here's an interesting question that I do not have an answer to. To either of you, this is from Jacob, do either of you, and I don't, have any thoughts on interactive narrative experience like Dungeons and Dragons or other tabletop role-playing games as it relates to storytelling and the future of the way we study stories?
Yes, I do, actually. I probably can't talk about this too long, and I would maybe encourage you to drop me an email or something, and we can maybe talk about this. But basically, story is the source of almost everything we do as humans. Every plan, every plot, every business that we imagine, every political platform, our own identities, all of those start with stories about our pasts or stories about imagined futures. And so one of the most basic ways to empower people is simply to empower their storytelling. And, the thing that I believe, one of the things that makes me relatively unique is that there aren't universal stories or a limited number of stories. I think that story is an adaptive thing that humans continue to grow. It evolved in our head as a way of allowing us to overcome different problems and exploit new opportunities. I believe that new stories are always being made and that innovations can always happen. And so one of the things that I always focus on is empowering people to tell their own stories. Your story is different. Your story is special. And when you're talking about an interactive story, like a Dungeons and Dragons or any kind of group telling, what's happening there is you're unlocking this even more extraordinary power, which is people to tell stories together. And anyone who's worked in the theater or who's worked in Hollywood, where storytelling really is a communal act, you discover that stories, when they're told together, go in ways that no individual could ever predict. It's this just wonderful thing, like putting all our heads together. And it allows for more innovation, more creativity, more discovery. And that to me really is what I think the purpose of story is just to keep unlocking that sense of possibility in us. And so to the extent that something like Dungeons and Dragons or anything else can do that, I embrace it completely.
Okay. Where did it go? I've had a question that I want, there it is. Karen, as a beginning grad student with some experience teaching high school English and a lot of high school English teacher friends, how would you say teachers should change their classes to better empower rather than just critically analyze? I love the idea of letting students create the syllabus, but that might be a little difficult in a high school setting. Can you talk more about what you would suggest for changing the teaching methods?
Well, first of all, I have to say that most teachers I've met in my life are really good. And it's more about like the standardized tests and then the things that starts to happen at higher levels, when it's like, this is how you get a degree in English that concerns me. But yes, absolutely. I mean, first of all, just on a basic level, we all know this. And I think every good teacher does this. The most important thing is just to listen to your student, because every student has her own needs. She has her own needs. And a lot of times in my life, the most meaningful thing a teacher ever did to me was pull me aside and give me an extracurricular book. And first of all, just even that act of caring, that meant a lot to me, and then also in that book, another thing that I love when teachers do is if they keep their own kind of secret library, their own kind of contraband, and maybe if you finish your assignments early, you get to take home one of the books, get to read one of the books, that's such a delicious, fun thing to do, especially if the teacher curates those books so that there's something unique and special about them. A couple other just things I'll say real quick, and these just, again, you'll pick these up if you check out the book, or if you hear me speak at any other event. But basically, first of all, encourage students to check in with their own emotions, how they feel about a text. I know we don't like to talk about feelings in class because we think to ourselves, oh no, unlike logic, where is this going? This isn't a thesis statement that can be backed by supporting evidence. What's being learned here? But actually, learning how to express your emotions, talk about your emotions, all these things are hard. And, if you can open up a space for students to do that. Second thing that's simple is just to ask them to imitate a work that you've brought in, encouraging more creative writing so that they pick up the things that they like in the book and then amplify them themselves. The dirty secret about reading for themes and representations, that's what they did in the Middle Ages. That's what reading was. It was turning everything into an allegory. It was turning everything into an argument. And the Middle Ages was a wonderful time, as we all know, but it was not a high point for literary creativity. And if you want to break that cycle, the way to do it is to empower the writers to write the things that they like and to imitate the parts of the books that they like. So that would be my main suggestion. Listen to your students, empower them to talk about their feelings, empower them to talk about what they like, give them secret books, and encourage them to creative write.
You know, and I don't know how possible this is. I suppose it depends on the particular school system you're teaching in. But I had an experience with my daughter the year I homeschooled her. I took her out of school for 1 year when she was in the 8th grade. And one of the things I did, she was already a good reader, so I wasn't really worried about that. But I asked her what she thought she should be reading that year, which meant books she wanted to read or thought that at her age she ought to be reading, but she might not read unless she were asked to. And she came up with a great list. I mean, it included To Kill a Mockingbird, which she'd heard about, and Wuthering Heights, which she'd heard about, lots of Shakespeare. It was actually really interesting for me, especially and The Diary of Anne Frank. And there were books that made sense to read at age 13. The most interesting part of it for me were the conversations we had about them and how much she disliked Wuthering Heights and was passionately arguing with me that there was nothing romantic at all about Heathcliff, that he was awful, absolutely awful. So, I mean, you know, while it may not be possible in an institutional setting to ask your students to come up with a list of the books that they think they should read, if you've got a curriculum you have to follow, it is an interesting question to ask to kind of go along with the contraband books, you know, books that, right? That makes a lot.
Yeah, and I also just want to say, like, you know, just to address the elephant in the room, there does need to be institutional change. I don't want to sound like Bernie Sanders here, because I'm not. But I mean, you know, we're calling for at least an evolution, if not a revolution, because it's not going to happen if we put it on the backs of individual teachers. There needs to be support, and we need to come together and say, we can do more. We can get more out of literature. We can be open. We can grow. We can try new things. And the science is there if we want to explore it. And the medicine is there if we want to explore it. And what we really need more than anything else is for us to come together as teachers and say, let's try something different. Let's see what happens when we all go together on this, because the students will respond positively and the growth will become evident and the parents will buy into. But it does need that institutional change. And, you know, I can just tell you, as someone who spent his entire career sort of kind of doing this on my own, is you can change individual lives and you see it happen. And I think every teacher has had this experience. But at the end of the day, we're just stronger together.
All right. We're coming near the end, but I think we have time for a couple more questions. Alex wants to know who your chief academic influences are.
So I have to be honest and give a little shout out to Ohio State, that the person who has most influenced my thinking in the last 10 years is Jim Phelan, who's kind of my boss at Ohio State. He runs something called Project Narrative, which I'm a part of. And it's basically this rogue think tank. Nobody knows that Ohio State has the world leader in story science and studying stories and how they work. And a huge part of that is because of Jim and a kind of global network that he's built and expanded out of Ohio State and brought me to. But also, you know, I think I just admire people who think for themselves and who follow their questions. And so I've just always been very personally touched by, you know, Marie Curie, Charles Darwin, you know, thinkers that maybe they were right, maybe they weren't right, but they sort of just kind of followed their own thoughts. And so a lot of what I've taken, honestly, from my intellectual influences is that sense you got to be brave, and you're going to spend a lot of your time being told that you're wrong, and why are you doing that? And you just have to be humble and know that you're probably not going to get everything right, but that hopefully you'll get a little more right than you get wrong.
Okay. Sabrina wants to know if Wonderworks would be a good audiobook listen.
Yes. First of all, everything about Wonderworks is wonderful. It has wonder in the title, and you should not question any instincts you have regarding it. But I have been told by my own family that they wish that I had the voice of the narrator who reads it. They said, when I listen to it, it just sounds like you, only smarter. And so I can almost guarantee you that you'll enjoy the audiobook version. And I should take this opportunity to tell people, the book is not really meant to be read cover to cover. You know, I mean, I don't expect people to sit down and start on page 1 and then read all the way to the end. It's meant to be like a library. You don't go into a library and try and read every book at once. I mean, you do, but then your head explodes and you realize you need another strategy. And, you know, the idea behind this book is for you to kind of get a little sense, you know, from the preface of how it works, and then start dipping into chapters that interest you. And, you know, read them one at a time, space them out, you know, give the book to a friend, encourage them to read a chapter that you think that they might be interested in. It's meant to be more of a companion than it is to be a kind of read through. And if you do read it through, your head will grow, but gentle growth, I think, over time can be just as effective.
I think a good question to end on might be Darren's question. What you're taking on seems very important. What gives you the most hope that the Academy could eventually get on board with your perspective?
Well, I'll be honest, the two things give me hope. First of all, this has happened before in the Academy. It was called the Renaissance. And during the Renaissance, there were a lot of people who used logic, which is the same thing we use today in English departments, symbolic logic, interpretation, to read books. Back then, the book was called the Bible. Now we have a different canon. And then all of a sudden, science came along. And it took a really, really long time. And there was a period of time when the scientists were considered mavericks and kooks and possibly dangerous and maybe even Satanists. But over time, what happened was people were like, you know what, whether they're right or they're wrong, there's something valuable here. There's something empowering here. There's something that allows us to change our lives. And it's that power to change, as opposed to the right or the wrong, that I think really excites people about science. And that I hope excites people about the way that this book works. The other reason that I'm really confident is that at the end of the day, I've seen how creative writers and creative writing and books have changed my life. I see in my students the desire for change, and I just believe that we all have that power in ourselves to be better. And when you see how much literature has changed lives in the past, I know that it's going to change our lives in the future.